Right now, this week, Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney are negotiating the future of the biggest trade relationship in the world. The USMCA review deadline is July 1st, 2026, 39 days from today. And the single most important card on the table is not lumber. It is not steel. It is not auto parts. It is the oil flowing under your feet through pipelines that American refineries cannot run without. Here is the problem with how this story has been covered. For most of 2025, Trump's message was simple. Canada is a burden. He called the trade deal irrelevant. He said the United States does not need anything Canada produces. His trade team told the press that Canada could not make demands. And then, on February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched strikes against Iran, and a choke point called the Strait of Hormuz began shutting down. 20% of the world's oil trade passes through that strait. When it closed, oil surged past $100 a barrel. Regular gasoline hit $3.41 a gallon within 1 week, up 43 cents in 7 days. The International Energy Agency called it the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. And through all of it, through every tariff wave Trump launched against Canada, through every press conference where his team dismissed Canadian leverage, one thing never got tariffed: Canadian oil. Not in 2025, not today. The fuel in your car right now almost certainly passed through a refinery that runs on crude from a place called Fort McMurray, Alberta. That is not an accident. That is a structural dependency baked into the American energy system, and it is the reason this trade negotiation, happening right now in May 2026, is not going the way Trump's team publicly described. This is the story of what the Iran war revealed about America's actual energy situation, and why the price you pay at the pump is now directly connected to a deal being negotiated 39 days from today. Here is where it gets really interesting. The United States is technically a net oil exporter. Trump talks about this constantly. American shale fields produce more crude than the country consumes. So how is it possible that American refineries are dependent on Canadian oil? The answer is in the engineering, and it is a detail that almost nobody explains clearly. American refineries in the Midwest and Gulf Coast were not built for light shale oil. They were built, modified, in some cases at a cost of billions of dollars, to process heavy crude. Alberta bitumen is the specific type of heavy crude these facilities run on. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, 60% of all crude oil imports to the United States come from Canada. That is not 60% of heavy crude. That is 60% of all imports. And the inland regions of the country, the Midwest, the Rocky Mountains, are so closely connected to Alberta's pipeline network that switching suppliers is not a switch you can make in a month or even a year. Think of it like this. You own a specific coffee machine that runs on a proprietary pod format. You have 4.8 million barrels of that pod format arriving every day by pipeline from your neighbor. Your neighbor and you had an argument, so you no longer need their pods. The machine is still running. The pods are still arriving. And when a global supply shock hits the store where you used to buy alternatives, your machine is still the same machine. When Trump announced broad tariffs on Canadian goods in early 2025, his trade team made a quiet calculation. Tariffing Canadian oil would immediately raise gas prices for American consumers. The political cost was too high. So Canadian oil was never tariffed. Not officially, not in practice. Howard Lutnick, the U.S. Commerce Secretary, understood the refinery dependency argument better than the president's public statements suggested. The tariff carve-out for Canadian crude was not a gift to Canada. It was a structural acknowledgement that the American energy system could not absorb the shock. There is another angle that almost nobody is talking about. When Iranian oil effectively left the global market in March 2026, the United States did something that created a new dynamic with Canada. America became not just a consumer of Canadian crude, but a re-exporter of it. Canadian bitumen flows into Gulf Coast refineries, gets refined into products, and ships out to international buyers, including buyers in Asia who can no longer access Persian Gulf oil. Canada provides some of the crude the United States refines and sells abroad. It could feasibly supply significantly more. Matthew Holmes, the executive vice president at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, described the Iran conflict as changing the dynamic between the two countries quite radically. That phrase, quite radically, understates what is actually happening. The United States asked OPEC members to increase production to stabilize prices. OPEC's ability to respond is constrained by the same Strait of Hormuz disruption. Venezuela, which Trump's team has repeatedly pushed as an alternative heavy crude supplier, is politically volatile and logistically complicated. Canada is a pipeline away. Canada has been a pipeline away for 40 years, and Canada has, by the estimates of the Alberta Energy Regulator, reserves that could maintain current production rates for more than 140 years. This is where the conversation fundamentally changes, because this is not just an energy story, it is a negotiation story. And the negotiation is happening right now, in May 2026, ahead of the mandatory USMCA review deadline of July 1, 2026. That review determines the future of tariff-free access for roughly 85% of Canada-US trade. Trump's team had spent months portraying Canada as an economic minnow. Jameson Greer, the U.S. trade representative, repeatedly dismissed Canadian leverage in public briefings. The message was simple: Canada cannot make demands. But here is the problem. When Trump signed his broad tariff orders in 2025, the chain reaction inside the American economy created a political cost that hit in waves. Steel tariffs at 50%, aluminum at 50%, lumber at 45.6% combined. The Tax Foundation estimated that American households were absorbing approximately $1,500 per year in additional costs from these tariffs, and none of those tariffs touched Canadian oil. That single carve-out, the one sector where Canada's leverage was always most visible, remained intact because removing it was too expensive for American consumers. Trump did not exempt Canadian oil from tariffs because of goodwill toward Canada. He did it because the refinery math makes it unavoidable, and because the political calculus of $4 gasoline in an American election cycle is something every Republican strategist understands immediately. The evidence is in the timeline. The tariff exemption for Canadian crude was confirmed within days of the broader tariff rollout. No public announcement, no press conference. The carve-out was structural, not diplomatic. Now here is where this starts affecting people who thought they were insulated from the trade war entirely. If you live in the Midwest Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, the crude oil running through your regional refineries right now came down a pipeline from Alberta. The gasoline in your car was processed in a facility that was purpose-built or modified to handle Canadian heavy crude. If you live on the Gulf Coast, the price of everything transported to your region by truck runs on diesel that also depends on the same supply chain. When the Iran crisis drove oil above $100 a barrel, the gap between what that crisis could have cost without Canadian supply and what it actually cost is measurable. Analysts at Enverus had forecast WT crude at $61 for the full year of 2026 before the Iran strikes. The conflict pushed it well past 70 on average, and briefly past 100. Without stable Canadian supply absorbing part of the refinery demand, the Gulf Coast disruption would have transmitted directly and more severely into every American fuel price. And here is something most people missed entirely. The USMCA review is not just about trade in the abstract. It is about whether the integrated North American energy system, the one that kept American fuel prices from collapsing entirely during the Iran shock, continues to function on stable terms. Carney, in his first year as Prime Minister, made a specific calculation that mirrors the Alberta oil workers' instinct on the ground. If you go into negotiations without anything on your side of the table, you get rolled. Canada has something on its side of the table that is right now physically irreplaceable. It has the crude oil flowing through pipelines that American refineries cannot quickly rewire to process anything else. This does not mean Canada wins the USMCA negotiation. Holmes, the Chamber of Commerce analyst, was explicit on this point. Canada is not going to bend the United States to its will through energy integration alone. Trump's team has too many other pressure points available, from sectoral tariffs on Canadian autos and steel to the threat of pulling out of USMCA entirely, an exit that Jefferies analysts estimated had only a 10% probability of producing a successful renegotiation as recently as April 2026. But what it does mean is that the framing of this trade war as America holds all the cards was always incomplete. The most important cards in any energy crisis are not the ones you can see at the press conference. They are the ones embedded in the infrastructure, the pipelines, the cokers, the hydrocrackers inside American refineries that were built to run on a specific type of oil from a specific place, Fort McMurray, Alberta, Canada. So here is the question for you to consider. If the United States is genuinely energy independent, why did Trump exempt Canadian oil from every tariff wave? And if the answer is that the engineering of American refinery infrastructure makes that exemption unavoidable, what does that tell you about the negotiating position that Trump's team has been publicly presenting to the American people? The Iran war exposed something that the trade war debate had been quietly avoiding. American energy independence is real in the production numbers. It is not real in the refinery configuration. Those are two different things. And the difference between them is what Carney and Trump are negotiating right now, ahead of July 1, with the price of everything that moves on American roads still connected to a decision made decades ago to build American refineries around oil from Canada. If you want to understand how the other side of this negotiation sees it, the Canadian perspective is worth knowing. We covered that on this channel. Link is in the description. And if you think Trump made the right call keeping Canadian oil tariff-free, or if you think it was a strategic mistake that hands Carney leverage, leave that below. This conversation is only getting started.